Now that we understand conditional expressions, we need to start putting it into practice. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to, first off, I'll say list A equals to 1, 2, and 3. So if you remember back, we did a for loop, so for some item, so I'll just say I in list A will print out I. And of course, that's 1, 2, 3. And I can also do for I in list A, I can print out I squared. So I star star 2 squares that number. Kind of cool. So now I can use my conditional statements. Let's do one. We'll do for I in list A, and we'll say if I to the squared, so we're squaring off I, I'll put those in parentheses, and then we'll say modulo 3 equals to 0. We're going to print your number is 9. And we're going to make sure that's true by doing print, and we'll print out I. So let's try that out. Press enter, and your number is 9. But we printed out 3, right? So we printed out the number 3, but 3 squared is 9. So that's a very simple version of using this modulo, right? We could do another sort of list. So we could say list, or excuse me, a very simple version of using modulo inside of a conditional, but also mainly the conditional. So if I change the condition, I can do something else. So I could say for I in list A, if I is equal to 2, we're going to print, yup, it's 2. If, so like else if, so if another clause is happening, if I is equal to 1, we're going to print something different. And finally, else, we're going to say print I. Something different. Yep, it's 2, 3. So let's see this, how this controls the flow of our loop and why it's important. So we're looping through the list, 1, 2, and 3. Each iteration, the first iteration is going to be 1, second iteration is going to be 2, third iteration is going to be 3. It goes through this statement, the entire thing, and matches it. The first match that it sees, it returns it, right? So in this case, we said if I is equal to 2, yep, it's 2. Number 1, that first iteration, the number 1 that's coming through, we don't match this because I is not going to, or 1 is not equal to 2. The second one, it does match, so then it prints out something different. And then finally, if it doesn't match any of those, it will print out something else. But since it did match this, it stopped and printed out something different. And this else clause happened when we hit 3. So let's try another list. I'll say list D. And we'll say Justin, Apple, food, not the computer, some number, another, and another number. All right, so we got this new list. Now this one, I want to figure out which items in this list are actually numbers. And I'm going to make a new list for it. So I'm going to just say list E is equal to an empty list. Right? So if I printed out either one of those, it would show me accordingly. So I'm going to go ahead and for I in list D. Remember, I could be anything. It could be any variable. We're going to loop through here. And now I want a condition that checks what I is. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and print out I first. And I want to introduce a very simple thing that is built into Python, and it's called isInstance. And you can compare something to something else. This will make more sense, and we'll definitely come back to this, but I'm going to say the number 3 and then int. I press enter, it says true. So this is a comparison that's saying isInstance. So is this a number? So is it an integer? If I did 3.0, it would not be considered an integer. Integers are whole numbers, and that's it. But if I also said isInstance, let's say Justin, it'll say false. But if I change it to str, it'll say true. kind of a cool little thing that we're going to use in this for loop. So let's go back, and we're going to now do for I in list D. And now what we want to do is we'll say if is instance, and we'll say 3 and int, no, excuse me, not 3, but I and int. So I being the variable for that particular iteration, so the item that's in that iteration. So if it's an integer, we're going to append list e dot append I. Otherwise, we're not going to do anything. And then finally, we'll print out list e now that it's done. And we have 2 items in there. So what we did here was actually parse the data of list D for everything that's an integer and put it into list E. List D still has those items. So we could have popped it out, not necessary, but we could have removed it from that list. It's not completely necessary, but it's a good example of how these conditionals can work. So let's go ahead and do that. This time, I'm going to declare a variable called x, and I'll say x is equal to 0. So the reason I'm using x equals to 0 is so I can find the item in any particular index. So list D of x will give me that first item. List D of x plus 1 will give me that second item. If you remember back to how we got any particular item in a list, so going off of the index of it. So 0 is the first position, also known as the 0 index is going to be Justin. The 1 index is going to be Apple, and so on. Okay, so now that we've got this, we can loop through it. So let's go ahead and loop through it. I'll say for item in list D this time, just so we're not getting anything confused. We're going to now print out the list D of x, and then we're going to finally do x plus equals to 1. This is the same thing as saying x equals to x plus 1, which essentially is saying the new value of x is equal to the old value of x plus 1. It looks a little confusing, but it's basically going to calculate this first and then set it equal to that new variable. And this is just a shortcut to do all that. So what it's going to do now is it's going to loop through, and it should print out every single one. Notice it's not printing out the item. It's printing out what the x value is in this list. Press enter, and it prints out every single one. This is important for what we're going to do is remove those integers from list D and only have them in list E. So list E, I'm also going to make empty again. So list E is empty. List D is what we expect. So now that we understand this part, there's a few things that we can do here. So I'm going to go ahead and say for item in list D, and we'll say if item, or excuse me, if is instance item and int, so int is an integer. We're going to append list E, so we're going to add it to list E dot append item, and then we want to pop out this item from the list. So we'll do list D dot pop x. And then finally, what we want to do is x equals to, or x plus equals to 1. So the very first iteration is going to check this, and then it's going to remove it, and then it's going to keep going. And then it's going to pop it from the list. So let's go ahead and try this out. And we got pop index out of range. Why did that happen? Well, it's probably happening because of the time we're doing this versus this. So let's try it again, but this time we're not going to put x in. So for item in list D, if instance is item, we're going to append that item, and then we're just going to go ahead and print out x to see what's going on. So x is 9. There's probably a reason for this, because we actually didn't reset x. So let's reset x equal to 0. And let's try our original for again. We'll say x equals to 0, and we'll also put list D equals to all of this stuff. So we kind of have to reset everything basically. So list E is equal to an empty list. There, so now everything's reset. All of our variables are reset back to where they were. Because realistically, x should never have been 9 because there's only, 6 things here. Okay, so let's do that loop one more time. We're going to loop through it, and I'm just going to press up. You can do the exact same thing. If instance is item, up again, and we're going to go all the way up to append, and then finally all the way up to pop. And then lastly, we are going to add that x to itself plus 1. Okay, so this is that original one we had. If the instance is, or whatever the instance is, it's going to be that item. If it's an integer, we're going to take that item and then we're going to pop it out of the list. I'm going to try this again. And now it pops out those numbers, right? So that's what this is doing. It's showing those actual numbers. So if we look at list D, we see only strings in there. And then if we look at list E, we see only numbers. Very, very useful for controlling the flow of our data. Now, of course, this might be a little bit complicated for you, and that's okay, because you can rewatch this to fully understand what's going on here. But once we actually put it into practical use, it will make a lot more sense. But basically what I did here was I created a simple for loop that pulled out the data or the integer data from any given list, and I put it into a new list. By now you might be wondering is how do we make this more dynamic? That is, how do I not have to type out all this stuff or scroll up or whatever, but I can still run this sort of idea? Like, how is it that I can take in a list and then send back 2 lists, one with just the numbers and one with, names? Now, how likely is it that you're going to use something like this? I can't say for sure, but showing you how it works is rather important, just because how these control flow statements or these conditional statements, they actually really affect how we can design our web application. But what I was saying about having this so we don't have to rewrite it, it's called a function. What that allows us to do is we can execute a function, so then this calculation can happen very easily. And that's something we'll actually talk about tomorrow. But if you do have any questions on this, let us know in the comments below. These lists and conditionals are very important and very useful. Lists are representative of big sets of data. So it might not be a list, it might be a dictionary, or it might be a tuple. But the point is, we would loop through them, and then we'd look for some sort of condition while we loop through them, and then do something different, like I said at the very beginning of this. Very interesting concept, very useful. It's definitely something you'll need to understand going forward, but we will revisit it quite a few times, even if you don't fully understand it now. We hope by the end of 30 days of Python, you definitely will. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.